Thank you for this, Seraphine. I will speak in 11 points. First, it was once noted that, ultimately, Martin Heidegger was never able to imagine that human beings could truly lose their world. Even though Heidegger is one of the greatest thinkers of anxiety and thereby of the loss of stability, established structures, and the like, this is the critical argument, never conceived of anxiety in terms of a loss of the world as such. And that's an argument made by Werner Hamacher in a extraordinary text called Vasen Celans Tottenauenberg, which was published in German in a collection called Kein Mal eins Texte zu Celan, not yet translated into English, unfortunately. So Heidegger's articulation of inauthenticity as linked to forms of unworlding, then, in this account, would risk becoming what Heidegger himself would have described as idle talk, Gerede. The following remarks will return to Heidegger and seek to clarify to what degree and to what extent Heidegger allows us to think that there is no world without the prior loss of the world and how far that loss goes. Second, what is not frequently mentioned about Heidegger's being and time is that in it is formulated a quite refined theory of courage. Heidegger is de facto one of the most relevant thinkers for a renewal, I think, of the thought of courage in the 20th century. There are exceptions to this in Heidegger literature, but they're just a few. I mean, Daniela Valleganoi and Charles R. Barmbach are some, but they're not that many. So in paragraph 29 of Being and Time, a book written in 1916, published, as many of you will know, in 27, Heidegger addresses a peculiar type of courage. Seraphine just mentioned that. Namely the courage to be anxious, the courage of anxiety, what he in German describes as Mut zur Angst, a kind of audacious anxiety. This courage does not have, here courage is not about confronting our fear or a danger. This courage does not have an object. In facing anxiety, courage has an object that is not an object. And this is, as we will learn a little later in the book, because anxiety never has an object. That's something that Jacques Lacan and others will take up later. To understand what is at stake here, a certain, I think, certainly selective reconstruction of some of the book's arguments is necessary and instructive. The designated thesis and term occurs in the book's second division, German Teil, which deals with what Heidegger calls Dasein and temporality, and it occurs when Heidegger thematizes a certain obscuring effect that results from the impact of what he calls the they, das Man. But we can get to this warding off of courage by the obscurantist effect of the they. I want to turn to some elements of part 1 of Division 1, especially to what is called by Heidegger, quote, the interpretation of Dasein in terms of temporality and the explication of time as the transcendental horizon for the question of being, unquote. The 5th chapter of Division 1 is called Being in as Such, where Heidegger seeks to account for what it means in the most fundamental terms to be in something, in a world which is just not a thing, right? What is a world? He elaborates first, that's paragraph 28 of Being in Time, I quote, the task of a thematic analysis of being in, unquote. And then in paragraph 29, the second paragraph of chapter 5 is devoted to, I quote, being there as a state of mind. In German, das Dasein als Befindlichkeit. And what is translated as state of mind into English, in German, comes with the connotations of being located, being situated somewhere. For sich befinden means to be somewhere, whereas Befindlichkeit has two meanings, at least. It means to be somewhere, to be located, situated somewhere, and it also semantically brings with it the ways in which, so how, the modalities in which, by means of which, I find myself in this or that space, which is to say, it also means state of mind, or can even mean affectivity. In paragraph 29, Heidegger states, I quote, what we indicate ontologically by the term state of mind, Befindlichkeit, is ontically the most familiar and everyday sort of thing. The mood, die Stimmung, the being attuned, das Gestimmtsein. Both the undisturbed equanimity, Gleichmut, and the inhibited ill humor, Missmut, of everyday concern, the way we slip over from one to the other or slip off into bad moods, Verstimmungen, are by no means nothing ontologically, even if these phenomena are left unheeded as supposedly the most indifferent and fleeting in Dasein. The fact that moods can deteriorate, verdorben werden, and change over means simply that in every case, Dasein always has some mood, ist immer gestimmt. Unquote. Heidegger here highlights that any good mood or any bad mood makes us understand that any being there has a mood, is mooded. There is no being there that is not mooded. It is the same moodedness, Gleichmut or mismoodedness, but whatever the being in the same mood or mismood is, it never misses the mood. Being there is never unmooded, because being mooded is the way in which being is a being that is somewhere. So mood is the way in which a being is somewhere. Being there is never unmooded, because it is gestimmt, in Stimmung, attuned, even when it feels badly or out of tune. Being there is mooded in the mild extremes of Gleichmut and Missmut, between equanimity and ill humor. This is how being is somewhere. More precisely, in a world, namely by being a being that is mooded. This is how its there-ness registers. In other words, Dasein is Mut, Gleich or Missmut, which is what indicates that being is somewhere or befindlich. Mut, courage, is a mood, and it is what indicates that being is a being there, that Sein is da. Third, this is a far-reaching thesis. There is no Dasein without a form of mood or courage. I quote, this is shown by bad moods, Heidegger writes, and bad moods is Verstimmung, which can mean detuning, disgruntlement, but also being upset and resentment, and more literally, being out of tune. An instrument, for example, is verstimmt when it's out of tune in German. Bad mood, Verstimmung, lines Dasein to itself, because in it loses the grip on its own being there, on its own Befindlichkeit and state of mind. It is the state of mind that forgets its own state of mind. It is a mindless mind, a self-forgetful mind. And Heidegger thinks this is linked, just spontaneous comment, linked to the concept of mind in English and Gemüt in German, because Gemüt has this affective and locating dimension. So why is this the case? Because when there is a bad mood, the bad mood takes over. It takes over our minded state. But for now, it remains unclear where bad moods come from. It's a bit like Freud, right? Where do children come from? Where do bad moods come from? Do they come from the outside or from our inside? I mean, contemporary help experts would tell us so. Heidegger argues that it's precisely here that we can come to realize that these, though both are the wrong questions, moodedness, being attuned, does, I quote, neither come from outside nor from inside, but arises out of being in the world as a way of such being, but with a negative distinction between state of mind and the reflective apprehending of something within. We have thus reached a positive insight into their character of disclosure, unquote. What do we realize? We realize that the abstract distinction between inner and outer are suspended once we understand that being in the world means that we're beings that are in, and that in which we are is not an outside of us, but is disclosed by our state of minds, by our moods, which indicates that we are in it. Right? So we disclose what is outside of us through our inside, through our insight. In this sense, we do not have a separate inner life that could be understood without considering our being there within the world, ever. And in some sense, this is textbook phenomenology post Husserl. 4. Being there is attuned, is mooded, and this moodedness is not simply an affect or a feeling, because this could mean it would be only subjective and therefore just an ontic phenomenon. Even though if we experience that being there is a being mooded in an ontic manner, we experience ontically that Dasein is mood-sein. Mood is more fundamentally determining Dasein than just ontically. So even though our experience of being mooded and of something, some affect, to understand where this comes from, we need to speak more fundamentally than just ontically. For it is precisely the Befindlichkeit, the state of mind that, I quote, discloses Dasein and its thrownness and its submission to that world which is already disclosed with its own being, unquote. Being there is mooded because it is somewhere where it finds itself. That's Heidegger's thesis. That it can find itself at all, somewhere, means that it is a being that is somewhere. Due to its very there-ness, which is not the result of its own free choice, none of us chooses the world in which we're born, being there can discover itself as being mooded, not only being worlded, but being mooded, because the moodedness registers our being worlded. And that means it finds itself as, quote, thrown being in the world, famously. Dasein, being there, is thrown, geworfen, and therefore it can make its own being into a project, an Entwurf. It is in this sense less a subject that we're talking about, and more a subjectile, which can make of its own being there a project, or one could even maybe say a projectile. Being there is a being determined by not having chosen to be somewhere, but by being a being there that can understand itself as a being with the possibility to determine itself. So being there, Dasein, is somewhere, and it understands, if it understands itself, that there is no necessity to how it is, where it is. One could say, to modify Mallarmé, a throw of a being there will never abolish chance. But being there determines itself and turns itself into a subjectile by also determining, by necessarily therefore determining the space in which it is, by disclosing what kind of being there is possible. So that is to say, being there does not only determine itself, but it determines itself when it determines its world. This is why for being there thrown into the world, the distinction between outer and inner becomes ontologically meaningless, or at least problematic. Its being is where it is. Moodedness, attunedness is thus what being there-ness in its proper understanding signifies for Heidegger. Fifth, against this background, in paragraph 30, Heidegger introduces the concept of fear, quote, to illustrate the phenomenon of state of mind, unquote. Fear is thus a Befindlichkeit, quote, an affective state in which we find ourselves, unquote, and it is disclosing because it makes us realize something about the situation we're in. It matters to us in a specific way when we feel fear. Let us dwell a little on this illustration. At the beginning of paragraph 30, Heidegger distinguishes 3 points of view, what he calls points of view, from which we can approach the phenomenon of fear. That in face of which we fear, wovor, the fearing, and about which we fear, warum. Both, just to note, both the wovor, literally the somewhere in front of which, a wherefore, and the warum, whereabout, another wherefore, have spatial connotations and emphasize, again, the situatedness of the fear phenomena. This leads to the determination of the fearsome, furchtbare, which is the object of fear that we encounter in the situation we're in. Even if this object's origin can be entirely out of the world, say an alien, as a fearsome object, essentially it is of and in our world. And the Alien movies, for example, somehow show that we extend our worlds outside of our world. We never fear that which is unrelated to this world. To specify phenomenologically what exactly belongs to the fearsome object, Heidegger indicates that it has the character of being threatening. We feel fear due to something being detrimental to our being in the world. And finally, we can locate that which is detrimental to us in a certain region of this world. Fear here has a direct link to knowledge, and more precisely, to knowledge production. We know there is something in a certain region of the world which is detrimental to us, and it is, Heidegger, coming close, unquote, but is still at a distance. Thereby, we learn something about the world. We might be right or wrong in this, obviously, and hence this kind of knowledge is falsifiable. We can assume it is a killer with an ice hockey mask, and is ultimately just a weirdly dressed friend at Halloween. But what is crucial is that fear is not originally produced by what is threatening. Rather, fear is, I quote, the mood by which that which is threatening is first discovered or disclosed as threatening, unquote. This means that it's precisely the function of moods to disclose the world and determine its character, and not the other way around. We might fear jumping off a plane, but without fear, we might not even have understood that this possibility existed in the first place. Fear can disclose something of the world because we fear something we know is advancing towards us, drawing near. We disclose something because as long as we identify it as threatening and approaching, it is not yet here. This sounds as if everything we fear is in the future because it's approaching. But what fearing actually is for Heidegger is the disclosure of what is present in our account of the future. This is why we here disclose the potentiality of the world. This means that we understand more about our being there as being in it. The spatiality of our being there implies that there is, I quote, a potentiality for coming close that is itself freed by the essential existential spatiality of being in the world, unquote. What it is to be in means that we're somewhere where things and others can come close. Fear discloses a possibility of the world that exists to its very disclosure. It discloses things being able to close in on us, as part of our being in the world. It makes us aware of this possibility, as we ought not forget that Heidegger already early on stated that his project, and therefore the phenomenological project, so the invention somehow of Heideggerian phenomenology, can per se be understood as, I quote, only by seizing upon it as a possibility, unquote. Phenomenology is about disclosing the power of possibility over that of actuality. Fearing thus gives us a sense of this potentiality or possibility. In a concrete world in which we are, we fear possible things. It exists because of this very disclosure, but it is a potentiality that is always linked to objects. What about? Warum? We fear is the Dasein that fears and is afraid. For, I quote, only an entity for which in its being the very being is an issue, ein Seiendes, dem es in seinem Sein dieses Selbst geht, can be afraid. Fearing discloses this being, that in its being there cares for its own being, as a being that, I quote, is in terms of what it is concerned with. So it's a being that is concerned with itself. It is what is concerned. It is what it concerns itself with. Heidegger now makes an important additional remark about fear that highlights what one can call its problematically dialectical character. For, I quote, fear discloses Dasein predominantly in a privative way. It bewilders us and makes us, I quote, lose our heads. Es macht uns kopflos. It makes us lose our heads. Fear discloses the world, but in such a way that it immediately closes and shuts down what it opened up. It makes us lose our heads in becoming mindful of a fearful possibility. It forecloses what it discloses, reveals as much as it conceals. It makes us lose our head because with fear we cannot see straight, or we only see one road down and thus too straight. It seems to orient in a world, but orients us too much towards that which we fear. Therefore, I quote, when fear has subsided, Dasein must first find Dasein must first find its a way about again. Let me say that again. Therefore, when fear has subsided, Dasein must first find its way about again. Fear orients as much as it disorients. That's the argument. And it is here that we are already able to see why and how fear can be operationalized and instrumentalized as a mode of disclosure of the world, precisely due to its partial and half orienting. And I'm saying half orienting because if you haven't read this, please read Adorno's theory of half education, Theorie der Halbbildung, which indicates that even half education can be sometimes more problematic. So half knowledge can be sometimes more problematic than proper knowledge. I think for Heidegger, fear is half orientating. It orients in a certain way, but in such a way that it makes orientation even worse. And this is what will distinguish fear in its operativity from anxiety. Sixth point. In paragraph 39 of chapter 6 of Division 1, entitled The Question of the Primordial Totality of Dasein's Structural Whole, and that is the first time that the category of totality appears in Heidegger's book, Heidegger notes that, I quote, if the existential analytic of Dasein is to retain clarity in principle as to its function in fundamental ontology, unquote, then it cannot but, quote again, seek for one of the most far-reaching and most primordial possibilities of disclosure that lies in Dasein itself. To find a way to articulate something that holds Dasein structurally together at the most fundamental and original level, a point, so to speak, going as far as possible back to this primordial unit or unity necessitates a simplification, a condensation of Dasein to that which is most relevant to it. I quote, "The way of disclosure in which Dasein brings itself before itself must be such that in it, Dasein becomes accessible as simplified in a certain manner. With what is thus disclosed, the structural totality of the being we seek must then come to light in an elemental way." Unquote. With the condensing simplification, something elementary is brought to the fore. And this is precisely what anxiety conceptually provides, a simplification and condensation to such a degree that things become elementary. The elementary form of Dasein is disclosed through anxiety because anxiety is the elementary level, the level of elements of Dasein. And I think in line with this argument, someone like Jacques Lacan will describe anxiety as the most fundamental defense mechanism. It condenses and simplifies all there is, and it's thus a basis. And I quote now Heidegger, a basic state of mind, a Grundbefindlichkeit. It is a Grundbefindlichkeit. It takes us to the ground, to the elementary ground level, where we are only what we are when we are there. Heidegger indicates that the analysis of anxiety, and therein, slightly or fundamentally, or both, different from that of fear, will begin from, I quote, the concrete analysis of falling, Verfallenheit, i.e., against the background of Dasein's absorption in the they and its absorption in the world and its concerns, unquote. Falling or fallenness describes a form of lack of appropriate self-determination of Dasein by itself, and the tendency, that's Heidegger again, to understand and experience existence in terms of everyday dealings, unquote. This is to say that falling is an aspect of Dasein's constitution, which is why Heidegger can claim that I quote, they is an existential and as primordial phenomenon, it belongs to Dasein's positive constitution. In other words, whatever negative description Heidegger ever seems to give, there is no pure Dasein. There is no pure Dasein. First, which then would be falling for the they. Dasein rather is fallenness for the they as a constitutive aspect of its being there. And in this sense, I just want to mention that in passing. I'm not at all convinced by Dreyfus's claim that Heidegger confuses the psychological and the structural when he talks of the they. We can talk about this in the discussion, but I think Dreyfus misses something very profound here. It is what Heidegger calls in autumn 1922 a Verfallensgeneigtheit, an inclination, a propensity to fall, which leads to a situation in which, as Heidegger states, in anticipation of Adorno's famous comment in his Minima Moralia 30 years afterwards, that, I quote, the life of the individual is mostly not lived as such, als dieses, unquote. This means that the life of Dasein, structurally, from the perspective of being in time, is not lived as individual life, for, I quote, it is the they that factually live the individual life. Dasein is not living its own life. In German, one could say, sein Sein ist nicht seins. Its being is not its own being. This primordial and unavoidable element of any being there, this constitutive disappropriation, indicates that being is disowned at its core. Or as Heidegger puts it in Being in Time, it is a life that, quote, in its everydayness has lost itself and lives, in inverted commas, away from itself. Von sich selbst weglebt. It's a life that lives away from itself. Fallen life is a life living away from itself, living itself away, von sich weglebendes Leben or sich weglebendes Leben, life just consuming itself away even from itself, being present in itself. It's a drugged existence. And Heidegger's theory of addiction, I think, comes in exactly there. This is part of Dasein's life. Some of its constitutively weg, or away. But this also means that there is a part of Dasein's structure within which, I quote, everything gets obscured, verdunkelt in German. Dasein has a dark side, so to speak, an obscure side, which springs from its being subjected to what others think and say. 7. The obscure side is an unavoidable part of Dasein's constitution that manifests inter alia in the very language in which it understands itself and its world. For it takes both as already having been ready-made as a given. It therefore thinks and conceives of itself not in its own terms, but in terms and orientations that are determined by the they, by das Man. It conceives of itself as they say, as anyone would think. The they is grammatically neutral, an anonymous third-person plural, and Heidegger will, in a manuscript written in 24, but remained unpublished during his lifetime, indicate that the they, das Man, is, I quote, the nobody, the no one is no one. The one that is no one, niemand. So Heidegger's question is how to make one out of no one, if the point that I was just elucidating a moment earlier makes sense. Having fallen for how they think, we think in the most anonymous ways possible, in a way that uses tropes and words and thoughts that do not seem to have any author, but also do not come with any responsibility. I mean, quite pertinent today, obviously. We're dispossessed by what seems to be ours. Part of us is thus constitutively anonymous. For where do norms come from? Where do our expressions come from? The opinions we never formed consciously, the rumors we heard and believe. For them, any authorship is lacking. This is why the they are, quote, not definite others, unquote. Rather, they are, quote, the neuter, unquote. A neutral anyone that unfolds, quote, a real, eigentliche, so authentic dictatorship. So that there is a authentic dictatorship of the they. That's Heidegger being in time. That for Heidegger comes with its own use of language, namely with idle talk, which in German is called Gerede. It operates as, he states in a lecture from 25, similar to the ancient sophists. And that's from the Prolegomena to the history of the concept of time, whose function he describes as one of concealment, covering, and masking, and in German it's Verdeckung. But how does this meta-obscuring of the idle talk against this background operate? He famously describes it by stating, I quote, "We take pleasure and enjoy ourselves as they, man, take pleasure. We read, see, and judge about literature and art as they see and judge. Likewise, we shrink back from the great mass as they shrink back. We find shocking what they find shocking," unquote. It's like a reader who would never dare to be skeptical about what they read. They just think, yeah, it's absolutely, and they repeat and repeat and repeat. They just copy what they read in their presumed masters. This means no less than that the modes in which we enjoy, judge, read, see, fear, and be shocked are not our own. Dasein is oriented by what one is. They're oriented by. In 1929 and 30, Heidegger goes as far as saying that the average man, the Normalmensch, he calls it, the average man in us, quote, takes his petty pleasures as a measure of what joy should be. The they is the aspect of normalization and naturalization of every Dasein. In a fallen state, we're following the they that represents, I quote, a set of understandings of how we ought to think, value, and act. That's Mark Worthel. In a fallen state, we act like they do, we think like they do, we like they do, we value what they value, and this means we see only what they see, we deem that exists only what they think does. They is a form of social media. 8. Idle talk conceals that there is unavoidable and necessary obscuration. This concealing of obscuration, this meta-obscuration, Heidegger describes in terms of Verstellung and Verkehrung, which structurally comes to replace, I think, Freud's two crucial operations of the unconscious, namely condensation and displacements, Verdichtung and Verschiebung. Heidegger's terms mean adjusting, pretending, and circulating, inverting. These are the modes of falling, he says. Verfallen, falling is ultimately through idle talk, verstelltes and verdecktes Verfallen. But that's crucial. Idle talk is never idle talk. It is adjusted and covered up idle talk. It is adjusted and covered up falling. Let me be more precise. Idle talk is what adjusts and covers up fallingness. There is a surplus of obscurity in this. Heidegger describes it as a move from Dasein to Dabeisein, from being there to participating. And I think there's a link from this to Walter Benjamin's theory of the loss of aura, to being in the process, to being thereby. So it's a move from being there to being thereby. Think of the supposed authenticity of accounts of eyewitnesses or the selfies people take when they're in the middle of doing something, or just people who think that authentic expression is Twitter. When they're dabei etwas zu tun, when they're thereby doing something. Dasein, by being there, is thus structurally and unavoidably also thereby participating. And in participating in Dabeisein, Dasein is, I quote, Heidegger, that's being in time again, fleeing in the face of itself, unquote. It is there, but it moves from there to thereby. It is there and not really there. In this turning away from itself that Heidegger calls an Abkehr, which comes with the implication of renunciation, Dasein avoids confronting itself, avoids bringing itself in front of itself. Dasein's flight from itself is peculiar, nevertheless. It is one in which, I quote, Dasein comes up behind itself, kommt das Dasein gerade hinter ihm her. So a flight wherein what is fleeing is the one that is chased by itself, or that it is fled from. I continue quoting. So there is no I don't continue quoting. Sorry, my mistake. Unquote. So there is no Dasein without flight, without falling, without therefore the possibility of obscuring through participation, the very unavoidable participation in structure. What does that flight then flee from? The short and standard answer one is used to give, I think, within the Heideggerian context, is to say it's death that Dasein flees from. But the signifier, death, at that point where we are, does not actually mean much. It does not clarify much. It is just a name, and it remains unintelligible what it names. Therefore, Heidegger can say that the they part of Dasein, I quote, covers up what is peculiar in death's certainty. So the they part in Dasein structure, so the structural part in Dasein structure, makes us incomprehend what death even means. For Dasein knows it will die. Something is approaching it, and it should fear it, and it should be an object of fear, but as death does not name any object of the world, death is not an object of fear, and therefore Dasein knows it will die, but it does not believe so. And so that is part of the structure of Dasein. Psychoanalytically, this is exactly what is called fetishistic disavowal. I know very well I will die, but I don't believe it. It thinks, I quote, to the very end, it always has more time, unquote. And this is where anxiety will come in. It will end the assumption of givenness, and especially the givenness of time. This aspect of Dasein we can call its structural side of Dasein's structure. It is the mode of the mode of the movement of falling. Part of the obscuration produced by it is by Heidegger described as turbulence, as Wirbel. Wirbel is swirl, vortex, whirl, and it also means that the they makes a fuss about all things at the time, about things that everyone's interested in, but no one individually cares about. So it is social media. Again, it is just attention seeking. It is clickbait. It is thinking about how many people look at something right now. That is the they. What is structural in Dasein and most anonymous is very inventive. It's agile and busy all the time. One could say one is busy. It is busyness as usual. This is das Man, the they, and the ways in which they describe themselves. 9. This whirl of obscurity fulfills an important task, as structure always does, as we know. It, I quote Heidegger, disburdens, unquote, relieves and lusted, which means literally the negation of a load of a burden, Dasein. Dasein is unburdened by the they, because the latter, the they, operates as a medium that filters all intensity in a certain way such that there is a, quote, a leveling down, Einebnung, of all possibilities of being. Einebnung, a leveling down, unquote. What Dasein under the impact of the they experiences, and what is thus part and parcel of any experience of Dasein, is a flattening, Ebnung, of the possibilities it can encounter into one form, eine Form of experience, a oneing, a unification qua form of all experiences. Something that Walter Benjamin will then call an impoverishment of experience, Erfahrungsarmut, and there's a Mut in Armut, an insight that Heidegger will explode and to which one, I think, ought to return at a greater length, but I won't do this evening. This unification of Dasein, Dasein's uniqueness, is reflected in Heidegger's pointed formula, I quote, everyone is the other and no one is himself, unquote. It is a mode of flattening that works by means of a peculiar reversal, such that, I quote, this normal human being takes his or her shallow fears as the measure of what terror and anxiety should be. This normal human being takes his or her smug comforts as the measure of what security and insecurity can be, unquote. The other side of the smugness, the other side of structure, of the structure of Dasein's structure, the side not of structure, is what Heidegger unfolds with the concept of anxiety. 10. Anxiety discloses, I quote, Dasein's essence as thrown possibility, unquote. But how so? Anxiety is, I quote, a state in which Dasein encounters the world at hand as drained of all significance, that significance that Dasein itself projects in its being in the world, unquote. In this sense, anxiety is, I quote, short of death. Short of death. It is a kind of symbolic death, we could say, the mortification of all significance, and I quote again, a complete collapse of meaning. It lets me see the utter groundlessness of my engagement with meaning, all this based on nothing at all. We encounter an already given us an almost too much of meaning, even though it's not meaning proper, that covers up all questions by having prefigured answers to anything, always already, all too ready interpretations, too much of orientation on one side. That's the they, that's part of Dasein. And in anxiety, we discover the opposite, a breakdown, suspension, or disappearance of this type of meaning, a too much of meaninglessness. There's no pre-given measure for either, and they are therefore perfect opposites, as it were. The they is a ground of our locatedness in the world, and anxiety we experience a form of collapse, a breakdown, that is similar to learning something about a hammer or a car when it breaks down. So I'm suggesting anxiety, although Dasein, or being there, is not a hammer, is anxiety's breakdown. The breakdown of Dasein is similar to, but also different from that of a hammer. The one thing that brings Dasein, being there, together is a moment where it is taken out of its fallenness and where its own flight from itself is stopped and comes to a halt. Being there becomes what it is when there's a break in just being there. I quote, "This breakdown allows us to see something previously obscure," writes Catherine Withy. Heidegger himself, in a later work, will indicate that Dasein's fallen side, its own opacity to itself, can also be understood as what he calls, and that's a quote from the Contributions to Philosophy, Beiträge zur Philosophie, a Weg-sein, a being away. In this sense, Dasein has to come into being there, into the Da of itself. Once Dasein exists, even if only briefly, it comes to see its own original Weg-sein, its own being away, as original, and thus comes to see itself as Dasein. Then its fallen Weg-sein, its being away, can be seen as what it is, namely what Heidegger calls in being inside a privation. After its being away has been interrupted and thus goes away, being there is seen as more primordial. This is Dasein's own Fortgehen. It encounters itself when it moves from the being away, from the Weg-sein to the Dasein, from the being away to the being there, moves away from the being away to the being there. With this move, which shows that there is primary, being there appears to be first secondary and then primary. It appears as primary only by breaking with the original being away. We encounter here what appears to be an act of double negation, I think. Breaking Dasein's being away, Weg-sein, with that act, and that's Heidegger in Being and Time, something comes to light. Namely, that is Dasein. Dasein comes to light when it breaks with Dasein's not being there. What comes to light is the fallenness, the Weg-sein, the being away implied in Dasein's structure, Dasein siding with structure, because in it something in Dasein is structure that is not only structure. So only by negating its own structuredness, Dasein can become Dasein. 11, and final point. Anxiety gives us an Aufschluss. That's Heidegger's terms, which is not wrongly but reductively translated as information. It means it gives us an opening, exposure, and insight, more precisely an unlocking. It unlocks Dasein's very own ground, the ground that will enable Dasein to find and encounter itself. Through anxiety, Heidegger clarifies what it is that motivates Dasein's flight from itself, its falling in the first place. I quote, "The turning away, Abkehr, of falling, is grounded rather in anxiety, which in turn is what first makes fear possible," unquote. The Abkehr that is falling, the turning away that is falling, being away as a result of turning away shows itself in and through anxiety as what it is, as a result that is made possible. So we understand fallenness as a result only, so Dasein's siding with structure, only through anxiety that temporarily shift things around. Now we can see that even fear is a mode of fallenness. When we fear we are not there, even though we experience the almost the utmost present of something where we are directly involved, but that is Dasein's structural side, and this means that is fear is an expression of Dasein, or is an experience of Dasein fleeing from itself. It flees from what it could be. It flees from its own possibilities of being what it is by finding things that it fears so that it can stick to them in a more concrete way. stick from what it flees from. For it is easier to fear a thing than that which is, I quote, the in face of which, wherefore one has anxiety, which is being in the world as such, Heidegger writes. Fear always has an object and is therefore bound to objectivity. Anxiety de-objectivizes. It is thus never anxious in face of, I quote, an entity within the world, unquote, and thereby undoes one's boundedness to the world, at least to a certain extent. But it undoes being bound to what seems unavoidably to be, and it unlocks being in the world. The therefore of anxiety is therefore, Heidegger says, completely indefinite, indeterminate, unbestimmt in German. This indetermination and de-objectification is so far-reaching that all inner worldly entities become irrelevant. Anxiety indeterminates, de-objectivizes, and produces a form of detachment, a form of déliaison, of unbinding from everything in the world except the world itself, which therefore gains, I quote, the character of completely lacking significance, unquote. That in face of which anxiety is anxious is therefore not a specific place, and it's not a specific place, but it's not a specific place because it is rather a, I quote, nowhere, unquote, and precisely therefore an everywhere. It does not come from, quote, a definite direction, which anxifies us. Rather, I quote, it's already there and yet nowhere. It's so close that it's oppressive, beengt, and stifles one's breath, unquote. In anxiety, we experience a moment of constriction, confinement, of too much closeness, intimacy, proximity, narrowness. Enge in German, which is what etymologically Angst, anxiety, is derived from. So, right, it's too much enge, too much proximity. Too muchness is thus linked, because of its indeterminate character, to a weird too-lessness, if you forgive me this weird neologism. But here we feel not objectively cornered by something, and that's my point, but rather, quote, what oppresses beengt is the possibility of the world as such, unquote. The world is nowhere and everywhere, as the world is not an object in the world, and that was Kant's famous argument. And in anxiety, being there encounters the world as a constricting form of being possible. In anxiety, possibility itself is experienced as constricting. The stifling constriction of anxiety, this condensation, detaches and unbinds, and so profoundly de-objectivizes that it confronts us, in a sense, with the truth of Dasein. It confronts us with the being possible of being there as such, with the world as such. So my argument from the beginning was Hamha criticizes Heidegger for not going far enough with this argument. And I would like to discuss with you if that is true or not. I think in the account I have given, there is thus no possible loss of world, even though it has a dimension, Heidegger's account has a dimension that we could describe as what he calls a withdrawal of world. No, that's not Heidegger, sorry. That's the formulation of Christopher Finns. But what we encounter is never a full loss. It's never a full loss. It is a coming to the fore of the world in its potentiality for Dasein, in the pure structure of Dasein, and the world as such. This is what Heidegger describes as disclosure, quote, of the world, unquote, as space in which Dasein encounters itself as being possible. Possibility is bound to worldliness, but thereby also, I think, to a certain degree, restricted by it. The possible being possible of Dasein is derived from experiencing the world as such, an experiencing of that which cannot ever be dissolved. Now, anxiety voids the world, but never its form. So I think it's an emptying out of what any concrete world is, and it lets worlds, the form of the world, appear, but it never empties out, does never affect the form of the world. And I think if one wanted to historicize worldliness as such, and if this were possible, maybe I'm just opening a door that one doesn't want to open or shouldn't. This is what this specific Heidegger of being in time allows one to see. One needs to radicalize his Weg-sein, right? The idea of primordial fallenness and break negating that fallenness. So in last sentence, if one wants to historicize, I think Heidegger points the way one must lose not one world, but worldliness as such. One must give up any form of givenness or do away with structuralism.